The iron chair, a medieval torture so cruel victims begged for death. In the long centuries of medieval Europe, life was shaped by fear, faith, and power. Most people were born into hardship and died without ever questioning the rules that governed them. Kings ruled by divine claim, the church guided every moral choice, and law was something handed down, not discussed. Justice was not about fairness as people understand it today. It was about control. In this world, fear was the strongest tool, and suffering was often used to keep order. Towns were small and crowded, with narrow streets and wooden houses pressed close together. Disease was common, food was uncertain, and most people worked from sunrise to sunset just to survive. Rumors traveled faster than facts. A single accusation could ruin a life. If someone was different, outspoken, or simply unlucky, they could quickly become a target. People learned early that silence was safer than truth. Punishment in those days was meant to be seen. Public suffering sent a message to everyone watching. Obedience meant survival. Authorities believed that fear kept society stable. They thought that harsh punishment discouraged crime, even if the accused was not truly guilty. Confessions mattered more than facts, and pain was seen as a path to truth. This belief shaped the justice system for generations. Among the many tools created to enforce obedience, one object gained a reputation that spread far beyond prison walls. People spoke about it in hushed voices, often late at night, when fear felt closer and darker. Even those who had never seen it knew its name. The iron chair was not just an object. It was a warning. For most people, the fear began long before arrest. The idea of being accused was terrifying enough. Once taken by guards, the journey through stone corridors and cold chambers felt endless. The air inside these places was heavy and silent, broken only by distant echoes. Prisoners often sensed what awaited them without being told. The iron chair did not need introduction. Its reputation arrived first. The power of fear worked best when imagination filled in the gaps. People imagined endless suffering, loss of dignity, and a slow breaking of the body and mind. These thoughts alone were sometimes enough to force a confession. Authorities understood this well. They allowed stories to spread because fear saved them effort. A person who confessed quickly made their job easier. Religion played a strong role in shaping these beliefs. Pain was often explained as a test or punishment from a higher power. Some believed that suffering could cleanse the soul. This idea made cruelty easier to accept. If pain had meaning, then causing it could be justified. Those in power convinced themselves that they were not cruel but necessary. The iron chair stood as a symbol of this thinking. It represented a system that valued obedience over truth. It was not built in secret. It existed openly, known to guards, officials, and prisoners alike. Its presence reminded everyone who held control. Even when it was not used, its shadow lingered. People accused of crimes were often ordinary. Farmers, craftsmen, servants, or travelers passing through the wrong town at the wrong time. Some were accused because of jealousy, others because they spoke against authority, some because they followed beliefs that challenged the dominant faith. Once accused, it was difficult to escape suspicion. The system was not designed to protect the innocent. As prisoners waited, time seemed to slow. Days blended together in dark cells where light barely entered. They listened to sounds they could not see and imagined their future with growing dread. Hope faded quickly. Many began to believe that survival was impossible. In such moments, fear did not shout. It whispered constantly. Guards rarely needed to explain what would happen next. A look, a pause, or a simple gesture was enough. Prisoners often knew they were facing something worse than pain. They feared being erased, broken, or forgotten. The iron chair was not just about physical suffering. It was about control of the mind. Stories passed between prisoners quietly. Someone would mention a name, a scream, or a silence that followed. Another would share a rumor about someone who never returned. These stories grew larger with each telling, becoming part of the prison's identity. Fear became shared, almost communal. Outside the prison walls, life continued. Markets opened, children played, and bells rang. Most people did not want to know what happened inside. Ignorance felt safer. As long as order was maintained, suffering could be ignored. This distance allowed cruelty to survive without challenge. Those in power believed they were protecting society. They feared rebellion, chaos, and loss of control. To them, harsh punishment was a small price to pay for stability. The iron chair became a tool not just of punishment, but of reassurance. It reassured rulers that they were strong, and it reassured citizens that disobedience had consequences. Yet beneath this confidence was insecurity. Authorities feared losing control just as much as prisoners feared punishment. The iron chair existed because rulers doubted loyalty. It was a response to fear, not strength. In this way, both sides were trapped by the same system. The accused often reflected on their lives while waiting. They remembered families, unfinished dreams, and simple moments they once took for granted. Regret filled the silence. Some prayed for mercy. Others prayed for an end. Many questioned how life could change so suddenly. Fear changed people. Strong individuals became quiet. Proud ones became obedient. Some confessed to things they did not do, hoping for a quicker outcome. The system encouraged this. Truth was less important than closure. Once a confession was obtained, the process moved forward. The iron chair was not used on everyone, but its presence influenced all. It stood as a final warning, a symbol of what awaited those who resisted. Even officials who never used it felt its power. It reminded them of their role and their authority. Over time, this culture of fear shaped society itself. People learned not to question, not to challenge, and not to stand out. Creativity, debate, and progress slowed under the weight of silence. Fear became tradition, passed from one generation to the next. Still, cracks existed beneath the surface. Some questioned the fairness of such punishment. Some felt uneasy about suffering being used as justice. These thoughts were dangerous, but they existed. Change often begins quietly, long before it becomes visible. In the age of fear, the iron chair represented more than cruelty. It represented a belief that order required suffering, and that power must be proven through pain. This belief would one day be challenged, but for centuries, it ruled without mercy. For those living in that time, fear was not abstract. It was real, daily, and close. It shaped decisions, silenced voices, and ended lives. The iron chair stood at the center of this world, a cold reminder of what happened when fear replaced compassion. This was the world where whispers mattered, silence saved lives, and hope was fragile. And in this world, the iron chair waited, not just as an object, but as a symbol of how far humanity could go when fear was allowed to lead. The object itself was never meant to look mysterious or hidden. It stood plainly inside stone rooms where light barely reached, shaped with purpose rather than decoration. People who saw it for the first time often felt confused, because it did not scream danger at a glance. It looked solid, cold, and patient, as if it had all the time in the world. That calm presence made it even more frightening. Craftsmen who worked with metal built it carefully. Every part had a reason. It was made to last for years, maybe generations. Metal plates, heavy joints, and fixed supports came together in a form that could not easily be moved once placed. It was not designed for speed. It was designed for endurance. This alone told a story about the mindset of those who ordered it to be built. In medieval times, objects reflected beliefs. Tools showed how people thought about work, faith, and control. The iron chair was no different. It reflected a belief that the human body could be controlled like any other object. To the authorities, it was not cruel. It was practical. They believed it served a purpose greater than the individual who faced it. People who worked in prisons did not speak about it openly. They did not need to. Silence was part of its power. Guards were trained to remain calm and distant. They treated the object as normal, almost ordinary. This behavior sent a clear message to prisoners. This was routine, not an exception. Fear grew stronger when suffering was treated as normal. The room where it stood was usually quiet. Not silent in a peaceful way, but silent in a heavy way. Sound seemed to disappear into the walls. The space was designed to remove comfort. No warmth, no softness, nothing familiar. The iron chair belonged in that space. It matched the cold stone and narrow walls perfectly. Those who were brought near it often noticed the details. The smoothness of the metal, worn by time, marks left behind by years of use. These small signs told stories without words. Each mark represented someone who had been there before. This realization made fear deeper and more personal. The device was never meant to act alone. It was part of a system. Guards, officials, and record keepers all played their roles. The iron chair was simply the center point where that system became visible. It was where power stopped being distant and became real. Authorities believed that truth could be forced out through pressure. They trusted the object more than the human voice. If someone denied an accusation, the chair was there to change their mind. The belief was simple: no one could endure forever. Eventually, everyone would give in. This belief ignored the idea of innocence completely. Stories about the iron chair traveled far. People described it differently depending on where they lived, but the fear was always the same. Some said just seeing it was enough to make a person lose hope. Others said it was designed to make time feel endless. Whether these stories were accurate or not did not matter. Fear does not need facts to grow. Craftsmen who built such objects rarely questioned their work. They were paid to create what was ordered. In their minds, responsibility ended at the forge. This distance made it easier for cruelty to exist. When everyone plays a small role, no one feels fully responsible. The iron chair also represented order to those in charge. It gave them confidence. Knowing it existed allowed them to feel in control, even when they were unsure. In times of unrest, its presence felt reassuring to rulers who feared rebellion. It was a symbol that power still belonged to them. For prisoners, the experience began long before they entered the room. The walk through corridors, the sound of footsteps, the smell of damp stone, all of it prepared the mind. By the time they saw the chair, many were already broken inside. The object itself did not need to act quickly. Fear had already done much of the work. What made the iron chair especially powerful was its predictability. There were no surprises. It did not change. It did not react. It simply existed. This made it feel unstoppable. People fear what they cannot reason with, and the chair offered no answers, only certainty. Some officials believed they were serving justice. They convinced themselves that the guilty deserved punishment and that the innocent would somehow be spared. This belief allowed them to sleep at night. It also allowed the system to continue without reflection. Records from the time often describe the iron chair in simple terms, without emotion. Lists, notes, and official language removed the human element. This was not accidental. When suffering is written as procedure, it becomes easier to accept. The object also affected those who worked near it. Guards learned to detach themselves. They avoided eye contact and focused on routine. Over time, this detachment became habit. The iron chair did not only shape prisoners, it shaped everyone around it. People outside the prisons imagined it differently. To them, it became almost mythical, something distant and terrible. Parents warned children about disobedience by referencing it indirectly. The fear entered everyday life without being fully understood. The iron chair was not unique in design, but it was unique in meaning. It represented a moment in history where power relied on fear rather than trust, where authority felt threatened and responded by tightening control. As years passed, the object remained while people changed. New rulers came, new laws were announced, but the chair stayed. This permanence made it feel timeless, as if it belonged to the world itself rather than a specific era. That illusion made change harder. Some who encountered it later in life had already heard stories since childhood. The fear had grown with them. By the time they faced it, they felt as though their fate had been decided long ago. This sense of inevitability was part of the design, even if unspoken. The iron chair did not shout its purpose. It waited. That waiting was its strength. It allowed fear to settle slowly, deeply, and completely. People often feared it more in anticipation than in reality. The mind filled the silence with worst possibilities. Over time, some began to question whether such objects truly served justice. Quiet doubts appeared among scholars and thinkers. They wondered if truth gained through fear could ever be trusted. These ideas were dangerous but important. The iron chair stood at the center of this debate without ever changing. It remained a reminder of what happens when systems value control over humanity. It showed how objects can carry beliefs and shape behavior. In the end, the iron chair was more than metal and shape. It was a reflection of an age where fear guided decisions and power demanded proof. It existed because people believed it had to exist. And as long as that belief remained, the chair continued to stand, silent and unmoving, shaping lives without ever speaking a word. They were not monsters or criminals by nature. Most of the people who ended up accused were ordinary individuals living quiet lives. They woke early, worked hard, and hoped for nothing more than safety and food. Some were farmers who knew the land better than words. Others were traders, healers, or travelers who stayed only briefly in a town before moving on. None of them imagined their lives would be pulled apart by a single accusation. In those times, being accused did not require proof. A rumor, a misunderstanding, or personal anger was often enough. Someone might speak a careless sentence. Someone else might feel threatened or jealous. Soon, whispers turned into suspicion. Once suspicion took hold, it spread quickly. People feared being associated with doubt, so they stayed silent. Silence made the accusation stronger. When guards arrived, life changed in a moment. There was rarely an explanation. A name was called and hands were bound. Neighbors watched but said nothing. Even friends looked away. Fear taught people to protect themselves first. For the accused, this silence felt heavier than chains. It told them they were already alone. The journey to confinement felt unreal. Streets that once felt familiar now seemed distant. Every step away from home felt like a step away from life itself. The accused often searched faces for kindness but found only avoidance. People did not want to be remembered for sympathy. Sympathy could become suspicion. Inside the holding spaces, time lost meaning. Days passed slowly, marked only by light and darkness. The air felt cold and damp. The accused replayed every moment of their lives, trying to understand how they arrived there. They questioned words they had spoken years ago. They wondered which moment sealed their fate. Fear did not arrive all at once. It grew slowly. At first there was disbelief. Surely this was a mistake. Surely someone would speak up. Then came confusion. Why had no one helped? Finally, fear settled in, fully, quiet, and heavy. It was not loud panic, but a deep sense of waiting. People talked quietly among themselves when they could. Stories were shared in whispers. Some spoke of others who had been taken and never returned. Some spoke of confessions that ended suffering quickly. These stories shaped decisions before any choice was offered. Fear became advice. Many accused people were deeply tired, not just physically, but emotionally. The effort of hoping became exhausting. Hope required energy they no longer had. When guards appeared, some felt relief simply because waiting was over. This reaction confused them, but they did not question it. The mind became the greatest battlefield. People argued with themselves constantly. Should they speak? Should they stay silent? Should they admit to something they did not do? The fear of the unknown often felt worse than the fear of certainty. Knowing what would happen felt easier than endless waiting. Some remembered their families and worried more about them than themselves. They feared shame more than punishment. They feared their children growing up marked by accusation. This fear pushed some to consider confession, even when innocent. They believed a quick end might protect those they loved. Others held onto faith. They believed that truth would protect them. They prayed, convinced that justice would appear. For a time, this belief brought comfort. But as days passed without change, faith was tested. Doubt crept in slowly, like water through stone. The accused noticed small details intensely. The sound of footsteps, the turning of keys, the movement of shadows. These details became signals. Each sound carried meaning. Each pause felt important. Life narrowed to moments between sounds. When they were brought before officials, the experience felt distant, as if happening to someone else. Questions were asked in calm voices. Answers were expected quickly. Any hesitation felt dangerous. The accused realized that truth did not matter as much as confidence. Speaking carefully felt safer than speaking honestly. Officials watched closely, not for facts but for reactions. Fear, confusion, or emotion were often seen as signs of guilt. Calmness was mistaken for resistance. There was no correct way to behave. Every response carried risk. As the process continued, the accused felt their identity slipping away. They were no longer seen as a person, but as a case. Their name became a record. Their story became a problem to solve. This loss of identity hurt deeply. It made them feel invisible. Some began to see confession as a form of control. It was the only decision they could still make. Choosing when and how to speak felt like reclaiming a small part of power. This choice, even when based on fear, felt meaningful. Others resisted quietly. They stayed silent, hoping for mercy or chance, but silence often made things worse. The system did not reward patience. It rewarded compliance. This realization crushed many spirits. The accused often imagined life beyond the walls. They remembered sunlight, laughter, and simple meals. These memories felt unreal, like dreams from another life. Sometimes memories brought comfort. Other times they made pain sharper. Sleep was difficult. Dreams were restless. The mind never fully rested. Even in sleep, fear followed. People woke feeling more tired than before. Exhaustion blurred thoughts and weakened resolve. Some accused people tried to prepare themselves mentally. They told themselves that whatever happened, it would end. This thought brought strange comfort. An ending, even a terrible one, felt better than endless waiting. The idea of finality became a source of peace. Guards noticed these changes but did not comment. They had seen it many times before. To them, it was routine. To the accused, it was the end of everything they knew. This difference in perspective deepened the sense of isolation. Not all accused were alone. Sometimes families waited outside, hoping for news. Sometimes they never returned. The accused imagined these loved ones standing helplessly, unable to intervene. This image was painful but motivating. It reminded them that their choices affected others. As time passed, some accused people stopped thinking about innocence or guilt. Those ideas felt distant and meaningless. Survival, dignity, and release became more important. The system slowly reshaped priorities. The fear of being forgotten became strong. Some wanted their story to be remembered, even if misunderstood. They hoped someone someday would question what happened. This hope, however small, kept them going. In this space between accusation and outcome, people changed. Fear stripped away layers of personality, leaving only core emotions. Love, regret, hope, and fear existed side by side. The accused were not weak. They were human, facing something larger than themselves. Their stories rarely reached the outside world. Records did not capture thoughts or feelings. They captured outcomes. But behind every record was a person who once lived freely, who once believed in fairness. This part of the story is about them. Not as symbols, but as individuals. People who were caught in a system that valued control over understanding. People who learned too late that truth alone was not always enough. They waited, not knowing what the next door opening would bring. In that waiting, they faced their deepest fears and strongest memories. And in that silence, their humanity remained, even as everything else was taken away. Those who held authority believed deeply in order. To them, order was not something that grew naturally among people. It was something that had to be enforced. They feared disorder more than injustice. Chaos, in their minds, meant the collapse of everything they controlled. This fear shaped every decision they made. Officials saw themselves as guardians of stability. They wore their roles like armor, protecting them from doubt. When questions arose about fairness, they pushed them aside. Doubt was dangerous. Doubt could weaken authority. So they replaced doubt with certainty, even when that certainty was false. Silence played a powerful role in maintaining control. Silence from the accused was seen as resistance. Silence from the public was seen as agreement. When no one spoke out, authority felt justified. The absence of protest became proof that the system worked. Those in charge understood the value of fear. Fear discouraged questions. Fear reduced resistance. Fear made people predictable. A fearful population was easier to manage than a thoughtful one. This belief guided policies and practices for years. Officials rarely saw themselves as cruel. They believed cruelty belonged to individuals, not systems. Since they acted within a system, they felt protected from responsibility. Orders came from above. Traditions came from the past. They were simply continuing what had always been done. This separation of responsibility allowed harsh decisions to feel distant. When one person made a choice, another carried it out. When a result occurred, blame was unclear. This division made it easier for everyone involved to avoid guilt. Control was not always loud. Often, it was quiet. It existed in rules, routines, and expectations. People learned how to behave without being told. They learned what not to say, where not to go, and whom not to question. This unspoken knowledge was passed from one generation to the next. Public displays of authority reinforced this control. When punishment was visible, it reminded everyone of the cost of defiance. People did not need to understand the details. They only needed to remember the outcome. Memory was enough to guide behavior. Those who questioned authority were seen as threats. Even thoughtful criticism was treated with suspicion. Officials believed that allowing questions would open the door to disorder. They preferred obedience over understanding. Records were kept carefully. Names, dates, and outcomes were written down. These records gave the system an appearance of order and fairness. But what was missing mattered more than what was written. Feelings, doubts, and context were left out. Humanity was not recorded. Language was used as a tool of control. Words were chosen carefully to make actions sound necessary and neutral. This language distanced people from the reality of what was happening. When actions are described without emotion, they feel easier to accept. Officials often spoke of duty. Duty to the ruler. Duty to the faith. Duty to society. Duty became a shield against conscience. When duty was followed, personal feelings were set aside. Over time, this mindset became normal. New officials learned from older ones. They were taught procedures, not reflection. Success was measured by efficiency, not fairness. Those who followed rules were rewarded. Those who questioned them were isolated. The silence of the public strengthened this system. Most people focused on survival. Speaking out felt risky and unnecessary. As long as they were not affected, they remained quiet. This silence allowed control to grow deeper and stronger. Fear shaped relationships between people. Neighbors avoided discussing sensitive topics. Friends chose words carefully. Trust became rare. When fear enters daily life, honesty becomes dangerous. Authority also relied on tradition. This is how it has always been became a powerful excuse. Tradition removed the need for justification. If something had existed for a long time, it was assumed to be right. Questioning tradition felt like questioning the past itself. Some officials genuinely believed they were protecting the innocent. They told themselves that only the guilty suffered. This belief was comforting, even when evidence suggested otherwise. It allowed them to maintain a sense of moral balance. Others were less concerned with belief and more with power. Control gave them status and security. Losing control meant losing everything. Fear of loss made them strict and unforgiving. The system rewarded obedience within its ranks. Officials who followed orders advanced. Those who hesitated were seen as weak. Over time, this created a culture where empathy was viewed as a flaw. Silence was enforced not just through fear, but through habit. People stopped asking questions because they were used to not asking. This habit became part of daily life. Silence no longer felt imposed. It felt normal. Yet even in this environment, discomfort existed. Some officials felt unease late at night. Some guards avoided thinking about their work. These feelings were buried quickly. There was no space to discuss them openly. Control also depended on distance. Those who made decisions were often far removed from their effects. This distance made consequences feel abstract. When suffering is not seen, it is easier to ignore. Authority figures often reminded themselves that the system was larger than any individual. Sacrifice was seen as necessary. This thinking placed the system above people, making individual lives feel less important. The idea of justice became tied to obedience. A just person was one who followed rules. A criminal was one who disrupted order. This simple definition ignored complexity and circumstance. Over time, the system became self-protecting. It resisted change because change threatened stability. Any suggestion of reform was treated as weakness. Stability became the highest value, even when it caused harm. Education reinforced these ideas. Young people were taught respect for authority above all else. Questioning was discouraged. Obedience was praised. These lessons shaped future generations. Power also relied on symbols. Buildings, uniforms, and rituals reminded people of hierarchy. These symbols created distance between rulers and the ruled. Distance made authority feel unquestionable. Despite this control, cracks slowly appeared. Some scholars began to write about fairness and reason. Some communities questioned harsh practices quietly. These ideas spread slowly, often in private. Change did not come suddenly. It began with discomfort, with quiet conversations, with people asking themselves if fear was truly necessary. These thoughts were small but powerful. The system resisted these changes. It tightened control when challenged, but the very need to tighten control showed weakness. A system confident in its fairness does not fear questions. Silence, once a strength, became a burden. It hid problems instead of solving them. It prevented growth. It trapped both the powerful and the powerless in roles they did not fully choose. Authority learned too late that control based on fear is fragile. It requires constant effort. It creates enemies instead of trust. It builds walls instead of bridges. This part of the story is about power and how it protects itself. About silence and how it allows systems to continue. About control and how it shapes everyone it touches. Those in charge believed they were preserving order, but in doing so, they lost sight of humanity. They forgot that true stability comes from trust, not fear. And while the system appeared strong, it depended on silence to survive. Once silence began to break, even slowly, the foundations started to shift. The age of unquestioned control was not eternal. It only felt that way to those living inside it. Time did not stop, even though the system once felt unchanging. Slowly, almost quietly, the world began to shift. New ideas appeared, not loudly or suddenly, but like light through small cracks. People started to think differently about justice, authority, and human value. These thoughts did not spread easily, but once they appeared, they could not be completely erased. Scholars, thinkers, and writers began to question old beliefs. They asked whether fear truly created order or only forced silence. They wondered if truth could exist where pressure ruled. These questions were dangerous at first, shared only in private spaces, but they carried power. They planted seeds of change. As education slowly expanded, people gained access to ideas beyond tradition. Reading and discussion opened minds. Some began to believe that reason mattered more than force. That fairness required listening, not just punishment. These beliefs challenged the foundation of old systems. The role of authority also began to change. Rulers realized that constant fear created unrest, not stability. Communities built on trust were stronger than those built on silence. While fear could control behavior, it could not earn loyalty. This realization did not come easily, but it came through experience. Over time, legal systems slowly evolved. Procedures became more structured. Evidence began to matter more than confession. The idea that a person was innocent until proven otherwise started to take root. These changes were uneven and slow, but meaningful. Objects that once symbolized fear lost their purpose. They were no longer needed in a world that began to value fairness. Some were destroyed. Others were locked away. A few remained, not as tools but as reminders. Their meaning changed from power to warning. When people looked back, they struggled to understand how such systems had existed for so long. It was difficult to imagine a time when fear replaced compassion so completely. Yet history showed that it had happened and could happen again. Museums and records preserved these objects, not to glorify them but to educate. They became lessons rather than threats. Visitors felt discomfort, not fear. Reflection replaced silence. This change showed how much society had transformed. The stories of those who suffered were not always recorded, but their impact remained. They shaped laws, values, and conversations. Even when names were forgotten, their experiences influenced the future. People began to understand that systems are created by humans and therefore can be changed by humans. This idea was powerful. It shifted responsibility back to society. If something was unjust, it was not fate. It was a choice. Justice slowly became linked with dignity. The idea that every person had value gained strength. This belief challenged old hierarchies. It questioned why some lives were protected while others were ignored. Fear did not disappear from the world. It never does, but its role changed. It was no longer the main tool of control. Trust, dialogue, and accountability became more important. These values were not perfect, but they allowed growth. The decline of old practices did not mean instant fairness. Mistakes continued. Injustice still existed, but there was awareness, and awareness made a difference. People could now question, protest, and demand change. Looking back, the iron chair became a symbol of a lesson learned too late. It showed what happens when power goes unchecked, when silence becomes obedience, when people are reduced to cases instead of humans. History taught that cruelty often hides behind routine. That systems can feel normal even when they cause harm. That the most dangerous belief is that something must exist because it always has. Remembering this past became a responsibility. Forgetting allowed repetition. Teaching allowed prevention. This is why stories mattered. Not to shock, but to inform. Each generation faced a choice, to accept comfort over fairness or to challenge what felt wrong. The past showed the cost of silence. The future depended on voices. The iron chair no longer ruled, but its lesson remained. Power must be questioned. Authority must be accountable. Justice must be human. In the end, the story was not about an object. It was about people, about fear and how it shapes behavior, about silence and how it allows harm, and about change, slow but possible. This was not just history. It was a reminder that progress requires memory, that fairness requires effort, and that humanity must always come before control.